Wow, this is a good crowd, and several online. So welcome to all my online from all across the country and around the world. My name is Tyleen Caffrey, and this is my senior music project to finish my bachelor's in music before I start my PhD in social work, because that all makes sense. Exactly. My senior project is a little different than probably even most senior projects. The idea was to collaborate and do an interdisciplinary project with music and social work. So this is kind of a combined of the two. We'll go with the next slide. So before I start, just a little backtrack. I graduated from Pittsburgh State University in 1997, and I'm only 22 for all my students. And I started in music and went 6 semesters in music and switched to social work. My goal was to be a music therapist, and so I switched, thinking I would go to KU and do music therapy. And after piano lessons, 6 semesters in a row of not making it, I decided social work may have been my better choice. So here I am, clicking my heels, coming back years later, and I'm finishing my degree. So I do want to thank the A&MU Music Department for being part of monitoring and overseeing my project. And then, so I am completing my degree at Pittsburgh State University in Pittsburgh, Kansas. If anybody knows the mascot besides my husband, you get like brownie points. And so I do have some folks from Pitt State online as well. So the focus of this project, like I said, it is an interdisciplinary project between social work and music. What I've looked at is I teach what's called macro practice of social work. So this is social work, our 4th practice class. In social work, we have 4 practice classes. And so this is our community-based model that we use for social work, and so I'm tying that into music, and I'll show how that works here in a bit. And then really what we're looking at is increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of community-based programs, and so with our music program. Next slide. So in social work, so this is what's fun about this particular, is I have a large group of social work students sitting my social work folks, and I have my music folks here. And then I have all the in-betweeners. Who's my in-betweeners? The 1 or 2. Yes. In social work practice, we have 3 levels of practice. We teach on micro, meso, and macro. So micro practice in social work is working with individuals. So this will be, I'm working with a person doing individual therapy. I'm working with one individual. Meso is more of working like with families or small communities. And macro practice is when you're working with larger communities. And so my focus, again, is macro practice. So when we're looking at the focus of this was looking at the Clovis and Portales community as a whole. So using this community as my macro practice and focus in my macro practice. Next slide. So the goals for this in macro practice is when we're looking at communities and how to help communities, our goal is to overall help the community and look at how do we do that. In that, it's how do we find the steps to reach that goal, and then we look at a framework. So we create a framework on how to help that particular community. So my thought was, can we apply this to other disciplines besides just social work? Can we apply it to music? And that is what ultimately my project was. So the guidelines for this project, in building the framework for macro practice, what I've done is I've used the Kirsch-Ashman book. And Karen Kirsch-Ashman created not only just a framework, I took her framework and brought it down to a different level to very specific hows. And using a general practice social work. So generalist practitioners, what we do is we look at all. We're not just administrative social workers or just clinical social workers. We kind of get trained on a little bit of everything about social work. So I'm taking this stance to this project. And really what I want to focus on is this last part here. The goal is really to, and I mentioned this earlier, is look at the efficiency and effectiveness of service learning and how we can deepen that within our A&MU campus and our local music program. So that's more specifically what I'm looking at. And I'll talk a little bit here in just a second about the framework I used. Next slide. So this starts our framework. So in social work, when we're looking at communities, we look at ultimately who is our population. And so this particular project is who is our population. What can I do with social work that ties into music? And what I discovered in part of my research is speaking to our local high school band music directors between Clovis High School, which I'm lucky enough to have Mr. Golden here at Portales High School, so thank you very much for being here. Sean Galloway is our Clovis High School choir director. I'm talking to students both here at A&MU and students in the choirs at both Clovis and Portales, and talking to our community choir folks, which I have a few here as well. What is one of the population, and for me, is looking at a very specific population, and that's what we do with social workers. We look at a population and see how we can make change. So this particular population, I'm looking at identifying that population, and this was very specifically music students in secondary education. In doing that, our framework is identify the population, then we look at the social problem, then we plan on how to fix that problem, and then we look at the evaluation. So I'm going to break this down for music. Explain. And online folks, if you do have a question, there is a chat feature which I can see, so if you do have a question. So applying the framework to music, this is where the fun part, because people think, how does social work and music go together? So this is my framework. How do I apply music to social work and music together? The first part is identify the population. This is very specifically was music students in secondary education. Why I chose secondary education is because most of the students in the high schools at Clovis and Portales are in choir or in a vocal program at the high school. I originally, for those who know me, I'm actually a band person, not a vocal person. So I originally was going to do music instruments and how to obtain instruments into students' hands who most likely couldn't afford, or the music programs didn't have those available. But the reality is we have to think about the time frame in one semester. By the time I collected all the instruments and then took them to Lubbock to refurbish all the instruments and then get them into the students' hands, the semester's pretty much over. So I look at, within my conversations and my collaboration with the choir directors, we looked at the music education within, hey, you're fine, within the high school students and the need for what they have here. So my population was very specific to Clovis and Portales high school students. And those are the two schools here that also have larger music and vocal programs. The second part is identifying the problem. So again, when we look at social work, we say, okay, here's our population. Now, what's the problem here? In our macro practice of social work, what the students do is in their practicums, where they do their internships, they identify those gaps in services. What do the students, or what does that agency have, and what do they need? And then how can I get what they need? So for all my juniors in the room, this is what you'll be doing next semester. So the problem is that in this area, there are not enough private lessons for vocal students. We don't have big music conservatories in Clovis and Portales. We don't have a school of music down the road, the High Plains School of Music. So if anybody wants to make that macro practice happen, we can make that happen. But as of right now, we don't have any sort of any kind of music school or conservatory for students in this area to receive private lessons. So what happens when Mr. Golden has a student that wants to do music, they go straight from high school straight to the college, and then they're expected to have that grassroots foundation of vocal. And what he can do is great, but if without the private lessons, there's not a lot of advancement. So the goal is, or the problem is, our students in this area don't have the access to private lessons. So how do we fix that? That's the area what I was looking at, is increasing and strengthening the music programs. So how did we do that, you ask? Next slide. Is breaking it down a little further. So identifying the population, I'm going to kind of skim through these next couple slides because this is what we use in our framework. Our students, when they identify the population, this is how they do it. They look at gathering the data about the community. Do we have music programs in this area? What is available to the students? We might have a few of the community choir folks who might give private lessons on the side. Not too many. We have one theater instructor that does private lessons on the side. And that's about it. We really don't have a lot. So gathering the data, mapping the assets, and that's kind of the secondary part of that. Who do we have? What do we have? So both of the choir directors, can they give lessons on the side? Is there enough time? Well, we think about how many students are in each program. Mr. Golden, if I remember right, you said you had about 60 students?
That's just the high school?
Just the high school, or 90 at the high school. And Mr. Galloway has almost double that. So if we're looking at that amount of students. Now, for those of you that were in band or choir, how many of you were in choir in high school? And how many of you are in choir in college? So not as many, right? So we know that even though there's 90 students, that doesn't mean all 90 students are going to go into a music program, or they're not going to all major in music. But mapping the assets of what there is available to help them get to that part. Now, for those of you who did audition for a scholarship to come to college, you probably know that vocal lessons would have helped you get to that and have either a better scholarship or have a scholarship in general. So looking at those and describing the dimensions, and this will be part of my research paper, but looking at what does the area have to offer? What is our local politics? What is our demographics? We have a very rural area, and this Clovis Portales is a very rural area, and a low poverty area. So even if we did have a big giant conservatory music school here, what's the reality of our students being able to afford to go to the conservatory? And that's part of what looking at the dimensions are. The next part is identifying the social problem. Breaking down the social problem, as you can see, there's several aspects of this. I want to kind of highlight a couple of them. One, the way I publicized really was just sending out the information. Oh, turn off the mic on the other side, guys. Unless you had a question. It's how to publicize. Since I was only looking at Clovis and Portales schools, really what I did is just focus on publicizing in those schools and then here at ENMU to receive the students. I do want to skip down to the risk, and this is where it's important for social workers to look at. Anytime you work with a community, there's always going to be risk. And one of the risks that I looked at, there's actually a couple, is one is how many ENMU students are willing to give up their time, their energy, for free. That's the key word, for free. Two is working with Clovis and Portales is I have to think about when I talked about the population, is we have kids who are in very low income and rural areas. So the reality of getting students on campus, or even if students were in Clovis, if I'll use CC since you're in the room if you don't mind. CC lives here on campus, and if she has a car, she can get to Clovis, but then what's the reality of that student even being able to cross town and then finding location? So I knew the risk involved was getting students to the location to do lessons, getting ENMU students to be able to provide those lessons, and then really looking at the realistic amount of students. And I want you to keep that part in your mind, is looking at the realistic amount. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit later. Obviously, I'll use theory and some organizational theory involved. And if you have questions about that, I can talk about that in a little bit. But next slide. And this is where I want to start focusing on is the actual planning process. So now we've identified the students, we've identified the problem. Now how do we meet that need? So what I did is I described in my description is what I created is a mentoring program. I contacted the students here at ENMU. Narrowed it down to students who have been in their vocal pedagogy class, which means these students have already been identified, already taken the class, already have the skills and the knowledge to teach someone else. So that was the first part, is looking at the ENMU students, and the secondary was looking at what is the reality of how many students at Clovis and Portales can, or want, I should say, free vocal lessons. And that was part of the planning process. What I found out is we actually had quite a few students who were very interested. There were 17 students eligible from ENMU to be able to give lessons, and 15 of the 17 did provide, or at least were on the list to provide lessons. And we received initially almost about 25 students from Clovis and Portales High School. And by the time we got permission slips and the information from the parents, then we narrowed it down. So we had 15 ENMU students and Clovis and Portales High School students that we partnered together to give vocal lessons. Now in this area, we're a pretty rural area, I think 15 is a pretty good amount. So that is how we partnered up. So ultimately, the planning process is creating a vocal mentoring program. That was the end of that. Okay. So how do we meet the needs? And like I said, the project, what it created for our ENMU students, so this partnership, is it created students' real life experience to music. Oftentimes, even though the students get vocal pedagogy, what we learned is, at least here at ENMU, and this also is somewhat the same at Pittsburgh State University, is ENMU students will often find students to give those lessons to, because that's required for their class, but they use students that's already here. So they find, where's Adon? Adon, he plays trumpet. Don't you want vocal lessons on the side? And although that benefits Adon musically, but can we benefit more from having ENMU vocal students give lessons to high school students who need the vocal lessons? So partnering up more with that. So that was the real life experience. And of the 15 students that we initially had, 9 were able to be mentored. Now, even if it's 1 or 2 lessons so far, we did have a few hiccups, and that goes back to the risk. We had spring break that we had to account for, times 3, because our spring break didn't match up with Clovis's spring break and didn't match up with Portales' spring break. There was Drama Fest that was in the middle of that week, so there was a lot of students there. There was NATS, which took almost a few days out of the ENMU students. And then there was Titanic, which was our play. So if you think about our semester, we were really limited to how many weeks we could do that. Even with the 8 weeks given, or I'm sorry, the 16 weeks given, we knew that probably we would get about 8 weeks in. But 9 students were able to be mentored, and some of those 9, most of them have had at least 3 to 4 lessons each, which still accounts for that. Next slide. So some of the reflections. For those of you who don't know, I'm originally from Kansas City, and this is the Kaufman Center in Kansas City, which is the music hall. I just thought that was good because it used a reflection. So a little reflections about the project and how it worked. So what did the music educator say? So when talking to Mr. Galloway and to Mr. Golden, here are some of the things they said. I think it's been a great plan for helping build student confidence and overall technique. Students have been more confident in their ability. Mr. Galloway said that the students from Clovis who are getting the lessons, when they come back and they're in class, they actually have more confidence. And when they're doing their solos and ensembles, they have more confidence in that way. And reaching out to Mr. Golden, who had a little bit more to say, but thank you. The project was most definitely helpful to choral students and gain one-on-one instruction. And I think that's really important, is that in the high school setting, they're in a choir. But when they were able to get the vocal lessons, it was one-on-one. So they really get more of what they would get in college anyway. And what they learned in the private lessons, they could actually go back and apply. And Cece actually did a reflection, and I want to talk about it because she talked exactly about what you said, Mr. Golden. So the next slide. Oh, I did reach out to one of the parents as well. That was a little bit more difficult to get the parents to come out and voice what they thought. But one of the parents did say their daughter loves singing and thankful for the opportunity to be able to have the lessons. Next slide. So tell me about your experience. Well, there's a little video here. Just hit the play. Oh, thank you, Dr. Delporter.
So getting the opportunity to work with a student was really wonderful. I got to be more connected with the students in the high school. It got me to be more comfortable as a music educator, you know, having that one-on-one time with students. I think that's really important for me to learn.
Okay, and then the next slide. So one of the questions I asked our mentors is, what was the biggest memory? I mean, anytime we do a project like this, you're going to take something away from it. And so I asked both of the mentors, what did they take away from this project?
Just how we immediately connected from student to teacher, because we're so close in age than I think usually most students are. And it was really fun teaching her. So
The biggest memory, I think, is working on some stuff for the Cinderella musical, and we had gone through it in a lesson, and then I went to go see her in it, and she did exactly what we had talked about in the lesson, and I was kind of just like, oh my goodness, this is a teacher moment, and I have to really like this. It was like the best thing that I could have ever seen.
Awesome, next slide. So as I only showed 2 students, that doesn't mean that not all 15 or even 9 students took away something. And if you guys are familiar, how many of you are familiar with the starfish story? A few? So I use this as a starfish story. How many of you have done any sort of community service project, like going to picking up trash or helping Habitat for Humanity, any of those? The idea is that you want 20 or 50 people to go help you pick up trash. But the reality is when you show up, how many people show up with you? 2, maybe 5, right? If you're building a house for Habitat, you might have a whole crew, but when it actually comes up. And we all know that anytime we've all done any sort of community service or volunteerism, that oftentimes we plan for a big group of people and then a small people show up. And that happens a lot, especially in this area. However, does that not mean that the 5 people that picked up 50 bags of trash didn't make a difference? And so that is kind of why I put the starfish story, that maybe when you see it as a one side, that, well, only 9 students receive vocal lessons. But the starfish story is, that's 9 students that were able to receive vocal lessons who otherwise may not have. That's 9 students who received free vocal lessons that they can take those skills that they learned in those 3 to 5, 6 lessons and apply them to either in choir and or if they move on. Most of the students are vocal, most likely I think are going to be vocal students either in college or have an interest. And I'm looking at you because I think most of the students in your program are looking at either auditioning for college or wanting to pursue music as a career. So were we able to help? Yeah, even if we help one, we just save that one from the ocean. If we just help one student get lessons, that's one student who might get a scholarship to come to music, to ENMU, to the school of their choice, or maybe we can see that one student end up in Carnegie Hall singing. We don't know, because ultimately it's a starfish story that we saved that one. So next slide. So how does this work? Community action. I've added a few slides here, a few photos. These are some of the macro practice in music. If we think about services, most organizations have a foundation. So the Kaufman Center, which is ironic that the Kaufman Center in New York, spelled with double F, is a little different than the Kaufman Foundation in Kansas City. So did I flip-flop them? Oh yeah, the one F in the Kaufman in Kansas City is a double F. The Kaufman Music Center in New York offers several different programs for kids in the inner city, and so it is a nonprofit organization that help with music. The Kaufman Foundation in Kansas City is part of the, it's where the Kansas City Symphony perform, but they offer programs. It's called Open Doors, which you can't see with the students online there. But their Open Doors Foundation helps students, it opens the doors for them to receive vocal lessons and instrumental lessons. NAM is another program that provides students with music abilities. And I also wanted to add the ENMU choir. We recently, for those of you who have seen our show we just performed, and we'll be at Clovis High School on Thursday, but a portion of our performance was on suicide awareness. And again, we're taking a macro project for those that are from this area and familiar. Suicide rates are skyrocketing. And even in Clovis and Portales schools, as of right now, we've already had 4 or 5 suicides, actual suicides, and we've had multiple attempts just in these 2 schools. So when we're thinking about a social work perspective, we're taking a social work perspective to how music affects our population or our area. This is another area of how we're taking a social work issue and applying music to performing so people can see the effectiveness of it. And I know for Portales High School, since we've already performed there, and on Tuesday we had our music performance, those that were in the room, A, there was a standing ovation, and 2, there wasn't very many dry eyes in the audience. And so that tells you that that music performance is effective. So there's that. And the last slide is for music students. I'm going to more specifically speak to you because I just did a lot of social work. How does this affect you as a music student? Most of you want to either be a band director or choir director. Raise your hand if I say yes. You will be affected on macro social work. Think about how many, and for my music educators in the room, there's already music budget cuts in the programs right now. Freona is already affected by some budget cuts. Portales has been affected by some budget cuts. You're going to find yourself in that situation where you're going to be trying to figure out how can you save your program. Part of that is going to be fundraising. And again, you identify your population, your students who want to go to whatever competition or Maybe you need new instruments or you need new uniforms, choir uniforms. You're going to find yourself in positions of fundraising. So you have your population, you have your problem, and how do you plan to fix it? And then you're going to do community involvement. And that could be doing a performance like suicide awareness to your community. That could be as simple as taking a group of your choir students to a local nursing home and singing Christmas carols. And that's community involvement. And most of the high school programs right now require community service for their programs. So whether it's National Honor Society or any of the clubs and organizations, they're required to do it at the school. And some of the bigger schools, maybe not Clovis and Portales so much, but community involvement is a requirement. So for those music educators, when you guys get there, you'll go, I remember Ms. Caffrey said, identify my population, identify the problem, and how do I fix it? And so that's the framework for that. So last slide. So with that being said, I do want to thank the ENMU Music Department and Dr. Gentry as well, Clovis and Portales High School choir directors, my ENMU music students for being part of my, and I don't know that I have any high school students. I know there actually may be some online. But is there any questions? Now that I did all my thank yous. Somebody. Yes, Jack.
Don't you think this might be even more beneficial in a community like ours, which is rural and has few opportunities?
Absolutely. You know, when we think of areas like Kansas City, the conservatory is not just the only place. There's multiple music programs. Even in small towns of, think of Lubbock, they have a music school. Here we don't. And so the two things that really affect is one, we don't have access for those resources for our students in this area, and two is the income. Even if we did, we could build a beautiful music school up downtown, but we don't have the resources for those. You got to put money in the door. And so the limited funds spent that. Dr. Carr?
Given the success with this and your experience with instrumental music, would you ever consider incorporating it with a band program, but not get them the instruments, but just offer lessons to those students in band that already have the instruments?
Mm-hmm. I think if this is something that I could or would be able to pursue, I would love to incorporate both of those. I think that our band students have the same issues. There's not a lot of oboe instructors to give high school oboist, that's not even a word. Oboist, it is a word? Okay. Students who play the oboe, even I think a trumpet, even though there's a lot more trumpet players in the area than there are oboe instructor or performers, there's nowhere to do lessons. I think your dad may be the only one, and that's only in your area.
Maybe.
Maybe, right. So this definitely applies to instrumental as well. Is there any questions online? Chat feature still there?
Yes, do you plan to continue this project in the future?
My hope is what I call a legacy project, is that I can use the information, and the vocal pedagogy program is Dr. Sherwood here on campus, and then at Pitt State is to offer the same knowledge, and so I can hand off that. And so should the vocal pedagogy students, when they're looking for their students to give their lessons to, will consider the high school students versus just the instrumental students that are here on campus. So it's more of a legacy project, leaving and passing on. Thank you for that question.
Are the students interested in continuing this, like maybe developing something on their own that they can help up and coming younger students with maybe?
Yeah, I think from talking to some of the ENMU students that this is definitely something they want to continue. Some of the students they continue on here at ENMU for another year, or at least another semester. And then, so the students are looking at continue that. If there was a program like, if there was a vocal sorority or vocal, like the Kappa Kappa, is it Kappa Kappa Psi? What's the music fraternity? Kappa Kappa Psi. If an organization like that would take it on, that would probably be something that, because then they can continue that project. So definitely looking at by the end of this to be able to pass it on either to Dr. Sherwood or to the students as well.
That would be awesome.
Yeah, Chris?
I was going to say, I know you mainly focused on Portales and Clovis. Did you think about reaching out to any of the Texas guys just across the border?
Oh, well, even just the other schools in the area. I mean, I miss Floyd and Dora and House and Grady and Fort Sumner and Bovina and Texaco and Freona. I mean, if there wasn't enough students between Clovis and Portales, I definitely was looking at, and I have the resources that I could definitely look outside of that. We were just students in this area for what we had. So no, and I think this could easily, those schools are close enough, and if you take schools like Floyd who don't even have a music program, but there's probably students who love to sing, that if there was an opportunity here, they would, I think definitely would take it. I know my online is going to wrap up here in about 2 seconds. So is there any last questions online?
That was a great presentation, Ms. Caffrey.
Thank you very much.
Really hard for attendance. Very good.
Thank you so much. I do want to thank you all for being here. And if there is, I'll stay a few more minutes if there's anybody here that does have any questions. But on that note, I do want to thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Ms. Caffrey,